So in this video, I'm going to show you how to take a noisy animation sequence rendered in Blender looking like this to looking like this. And we're going to be using Blender's spatial denoiser along with Neat Video, which will use temporal denoising and local flicker reduction, as well as jitter of details removal. But we won't even use that portion in this video. We're just going to use local flicker removal. And then to top it off, we're going to run this footage through Video Enhance AI and upscale it from 1080p to 4K. And then from there, we are going to apply some final little touches like film grain to mask out any artifacts and a vignette and that sort of stuff. And then we're going to render it out for a final video. So I hope this tutorial will be helpful to you and open your eyes to what's possible using lower render settings than you may be comfortable with, and then doing some trickery in post-production to clean it up. Especially it could be useful if you're on a time crunch. So I hope this video helps. Let's get started. So first I want to mention that this architecture scene is created by Evermotion and it's part of one of their architectural visualization packs. However, I did create the camera animation. So I just wanted to give credit to Evermotion for these architecture scenes that they create. So for the render settings, I actually use a noise threshold of 0.03, and you'll see a little later why. Now the max samples were 16,384, which is actually quite a lot of samples. But the reasoning behind this was my techniques, the technique I'm going to be demonstrating, I can definitely do quite a bit of denoising with pretty grainy footage. But the highlights from where the light falls, that tends to be very noisy, and so I am going to focus my samples to those areas. So I'm biasing my samples towards the really high noisy areas. It's kind of a simplistic path guiding idea, but of course it's not true path guiding. But I'm just putting a lot of effort into the noisy areas, and I'm allowing still a large amount of noise in the scene with a 0.03 noise threshold. Now, these frames in 1920 by 1080 took roughly an average of 5 minutes per frame, and I'm using an RTX 3090 graphics card. I'm using optics, and I didn't even use my CPU because I found that sometimes the CPU is a bit of a bottleneck. That definitely was true when Blender used bucket-based rendering, but now it's still sometimes a little bit slower when you're using the CPU and the GPU combined, so I just turn off the CPU here and let the GPU go by itself. But I just want to mention that this particular scene uses around 20 gigabytes of video memory when you're using the graphical user interface. If you use like batch rendering, for example, then it might use around 16 gigabytes of VRAM, so it is a pretty heavy scene. So I just wanted to mention that you're probably not going to be rendering this scene unless you're using something like an RTX 3090 on graphics card, of course. You can render it on CPU, but I'm just mentioning that this 5 minutes per frame is being rendered on GPU. Let's keep going down our settings here. 0.03 noise threshold, max sample 16,384. I turned on denoising with default settings. And then on the advanced tab, seed, I clicked on this button here, and that will animate the seed so that your noise pattern is random. It's different per frame. And then we keep going down. These are my max bounces settings, so you can see how they're set here. Nothing really crazy. Default settings would have probably been fine too. Now clamping, I did clamp the indirect light to 12, and I had some fireflies, and by clamping it, the direct light to 100 and the indirect to 12, that definitely helped to get rid of those little fireflies in the render. Now, currently Blender 3.4 has path guiding, which does help reduce the fireflies, but it's currently only supported on CPU rendering. But future versions of Blender will support this on GPU as well, and so you should have to clamp your direct and indirect light a lot less, because it's a biased rendering approach. You are introducing some bias into your render, so just keep that in mind, that while I did clamp my lighting to reduce my fireflies, in future versions of Blender, right now you can render on the CPU and you don't have to clamp as much, and then you will see that more when it's implemented on the GPU too. So it's just kind of nice to be aware of that. And then everything else I pretty much left alone. I did play with fast GI approximation a little bit, but I just wasn't getting as good results. I mean, it is a biased approach, but you should look up some tutorials on fast GI approximation. It can speed up your renders a little bit in certain situations, but again, it is a biased approach. So it'll take a little bit of realism away from your scene. And aside from that, I also use motion blur with a default setting of 0.5, which gives you a nice 180-degree shutter angle. And that's really about it. Everything else is default. Memory tile size, I believe, is default. I used persistent data for the final render, which it will consume a little bit more memory because it keeps the data in memory after it's done rendering a frame. It'll then not have to retranslate or reload textures into memory. And then for color management, I just use filmic with very high contrast, and everything else is alone. We're going to go to our export settings, our output. So for the output, I use the control middle mouse there to scroll to my next panel in the properties panel. So anyways, we're using the multi-layer EXR with full floating point. This is going to be a very high quality image, and we're going to be using these EXRs to input into Neat Video to denoise them. We're going to go to the next page, and we're just going to be using the combined pass, which is everything. That's like the beauty pass with denoising and everything on it. And then we're going to output denoising data. I think this is not really necessary. This is if you want to plug your results into the denoise node in the compositor, but I'm still going to output it. To be honest, I don't think it's necessary for this. And that's really about it. So we choose our folder, and of course the spatial resolution is 1920 by 1080, and we're at 24 FPS. And we will be upscaling this to 4K with Video Enhanced AI, and I think you'll be impressed by the results. So let's go and go to render and render animation. And again, these frames were taking about 5 minutes per frame. Some frames took a little longer, 6 minutes, and some frames took around 4 minutes and 30 seconds, but they were averaging, most frames were just under 5 minutes. So I think the average was around 5 minutes per frame. Again, I was rendering on an RTX 3090 graphics card, and this sequence, it's 30 seconds at 24 frames per second, so it took a few days to render. So let's go ahead and go into the compositor and see what we can do with our final frames. So this is the original render from Blender. You can see it's very noisy. Now notice how these areas where the light hits the floor here, they're not very noisy. 0.03 noise threshold produced a pretty noisy image here. However, because we had 16,384 samples, we had a lot of samples, these areas were not very noisy at all. I did try rendering this scene with a lot less samples, and with a tighter noise threshold, but I was finding that this area here, these areas were very noisy, and no matter how hard I tried, I had to significantly degrade the image to denoise these areas the most. And yes, I could have used Power Windows and DaVinci Resolve, and I could have done crypto mats, but I'm trying to keep this very simple. And so I just want to do a overall denoising on the whole thing. So again, these were 5 minutes per frame. So this is the original render. As you can see, it's very noisy. This is straight from Blender. And then this is the denoised beauty pass, but we are using Blender's spatial denoiser, which is fantastic and excellent. It's especially great for single images, but because it's a spatial denoiser, you can see splotchiness over here, see? So after some tests, what I found was I would go ahead and mix the noisy image with the combined, the beauty pass, that has the denoising built into it. This is the original render, noisy image. I combine it into a mix node, and then from here, we pass this out to our composite. But I used about 0.75, so 75%. That means that we are still getting, if we go ahead and go over here like this and move it, we are getting 25% of the original noise, and then 75% of the image is denoised with Blender's spatial denoiser. And I found that 75% was good because I still have some noise in the image to grab onto in Neat Video. So let's go ahead and, again, I'm going to render this out with 1920 by 1080, 24 FPS, and then I'm still going to be outputting some EXRs as well. And we'll be importing these into DaVinci Resolve. So let's go ahead, and you will just go to Render Animation, and we'll go and open up Resolve. So I'm in DaVinci Resolve now, and here's my timeline settings. 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second. I'm in the media page, and I've navigated on my hard drive to the EXR image sequence. So this is the one that I exported from Blender's compositor with the 75% spatial denoising and the 25% original noise. And before I drag it into the media pool, I'm going to right click it and go to Scene Cut Detection. So you can see this is how we're going to take this whole image sequence, which is 5 cameras, and instead of trying to find the frames ourselves, we're just going to use the automated tool here, Auto Scene Detect. Now it's going to think about it, and then what you want to do is before you are finished with this window here, you want to click on each one of these and make sure that it has analyzed each scene cut correctly. So this right here should be the difference between the next shot and the previous shot. So this is correct. Let's click on this one. This is also correct. Let's click on this. Correct and correct. If you get things, if things aren't exactly correct, you can drag this down. This will help tail resolve to be a bit more sensitive in its analyzing of scene cuts. And if it's a little bit too liberal with its analyzation, you can bring this up. But generally around 1/3 is pretty good. The default settings is what I used here and it worked fine. We're going to go to Add Cuts to Media Pool, this button down here in the bottom right corner. And now we are going to get out of this. And you can see now these media cuts are in the media pool. So we can go ahead and go to the timeline and drag these into our timeline. And we'll just go over here and press backspace to get rid of all that dead space. And as you can see, we have all of our shots arranged properly in the timeline now. So as you can see, it looks pretty contrasty and it doesn't look right. That's because we rendered in linear color space. We rendered OpenEXRs. So we have the most information here and massive amount of dynamic range, so we need to transform this, kind of like how in Blender we have the view transform and we can choose filmic with very high contrast. So I'm going to show you a download link of where you can get the LUTs that I'm going to be using right now to transform this information to where it looks just like Blender's view transform. So I'm currently in the color page in Resolve, and we have a serial node here. We're going to go and apply our first LUT. That's going to be Filmic Resolve Scene Linear to Base Encoding. And then we're just going to press Alt-S to make a new node, and we're going to use Filmic Resolve Very High Contrast. So now we have recreated Blender's view transforms in DaVinci Resolve, and we're going to just apply this this node setup, this very simple 2-node setup to all these other shots. So I'm just going to select all these other shots and middle mouse button on the original to copy the grade over. So as you can see, we now have the same results over here. So this basically is the way it looked like in Blender. And now we're going to get to the fun stuff. We're going to denoise this, and we're going to remove all these splotches in this flicker here. We won't be able to get rid of it 100%, but I think you'll be impressed by, especially with the intro video, of how much cleaner we got it. So let's go and do that now. So I'm going to use Neat Video. Neat Video is arguably the best tool for denoising your footage. In this case, let's go and use the first clip, and I'm just going to bring this down to timeline because it's going to be smaller over here. Okay, we're going to select this first node and then press Shift-S to add a new serial node prior to that, and then drag on Reduce Noise and then go to Prepare Noise Profile. Alright, so now we're in Neat Video, and the reason why everything looks quite dark is because we are working on the EXR data prior to those LUTs, and as you may know, LUTs do clip information, so just to be safe I wanted to work on the noise prior to the LUTs, but it probably would be fine to work on it after too, but anyway, this is what I'm doing. So this is not going to be a full-blown Neat Video tutorial because this software has got a lot of settings and everything. However, I can link some tutorials in the description, and if you watch them for about an hour or 2 hours, you will learn pretty much what you need to know about Neat Video. It is one of the best denoising programs. It's usually around $100. It's not too expensive, and most people use it to denoise video, but I'm using it to denoise renders in Blender here, and you're going to see some quite impressive results. So I'm just going to go ahead and use Auto Profile right now. And what it's doing is it's going to analyze and find a region of the frame that has the least amount of details and just noise. So ideally a lot of noise and very low actual details. So it's chosen this frame here, this area of the frame. It's also analyzed frames before and after. So what we're going to do now is you can tweak this profile using you can go to Begin here, and this is an auto profile. Now your image is going to look very blurry, but that's okay. This is just a preview, and you can adjust the luma, you can adjust the chrominance or the red channel here, and then also the blue one here. But for now I'm going to leave this at default, and you can also adjust frequencies. So let's just go to Finish and go to Adjust and Preview. Now you're seeing the denoise result. So as you can see, if we hover our mouse and middle mouse click, you can see this is before and this is after. Now you can go to the filter settings check, and we can go to the noise level check, and I can just crank this slider up a little bit, and I think that's more than enough. But the slider that I find most interesting is local flicker check. This will look at areas that have flicker, and this will significantly reduce the flicker. So let's up that quite a bit. We'll up it a little bit more, and now we've removed pretty much all local flicker from this. We're going to go to Finish, and we'll just set our, this is temporal denoising, by the way, so we're looking at frames before and after, and you can see 2 orange outlines here on the frames before and after. That's because the temporal radius is set to 2 frames. We can set it to 1 frame if we're seeing some artifacts. So we'll just use 1 frame for now, that's fine, and we'll set the quality to high. We'll go to spatial, and for the moment I'm not going to use the spatial. However, I may very well want to mix the original noise just a small amount with this, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to we're just doing temporal denoising only here. So I did forget to mention something about neat video. There's another setting under temporal denoising called jitter of details, and you can enable it. And so you might want to play with that setting too. It could also prove quite useful for getting rid of any additional jitter. So if the local flicker doesn't do it for you, you might be able to use this and get even better results. But for this tutorial, I have not used jitter of details removal. Let's go to apply. And now it's going to bring us back to resolve. So here's the splotchiness in the original, and now I'm just going to press Ctrl D to re-engage the neat video effect, and you can see it's mostly gone now. You won't be able to get rid of it completely, but it's mostly gone. This is before, and this is after. So that's temporal denoising. We're using one frame, and again, if I go to my effects panel and go to adjust filter settings for neat video, you can see I'm using a high quality with 1 radius. Now if I crank this radius higher, which was set at 2, that's the default by the way, we will get a more aggressive temporal denoising result. However, temporal denoising, it does remove detail by the way, so you really want to find a balance. So I find that a setting of 1 is what's working for me on this shot here, on these shots here. So that's our denoise result. Now what we can do is we can go back to our clips here. We can copy this on over to another shot, which is what I've just done here. But, and it's working fine. It looks completely acceptable. Again, this is before. You see how bad that flicker is? That local flicker? Look at how bad that is. Now we're going to re-enable our neat video, and now it is much more manageable. And you can do this on a per shot basis, but this is a simple video here and I'm seeing good results, so we're going to move on to the next shot. I'm going to simply, again, select the clip and middle mouse over to that, and now we're going to copy the grade over. Again, this is the original, so if we get rid of this and go over here, this is the original. You can see a lot of flickering over here, a lot of flickering. Now we're going to re-engage neat video, and you can see most of that flicker is gone. It may not be 100% gone, especially in really detailed areas, but it is way better than before, way better. Now we're going to copy and paste this over here too, to this shot. You can see this is the original, a lot of flicker, especially over here. You can see a lot of flicker here. You can also see a lot of flicker over here. And now we're going to enable neat video. And neat video is quite smart because this area here is not flicker. This is actually lighting. It's a reflection on that plate. And so neat video, it's actually quite impressive because this is the original flicker, and now we're using neat video. It's not really removing that. So again, it's removing flicker, and we're getting a much more respectable result. Again, these are 5-minute frames at 1080p, rendering on the graphics card. So let's go and do the last shot. We're just going to go and copy the grade over because we're keeping it simple here. And when we copy the grade over, it copies over, of course, all the nodes, and we are copying the neat video effect as well. But again, if you wanted to adjust the neat video effect per shot, you could just go into the settings per shot, of course, and do that. Let's go ahead and see how it looks. And again, we can bring up our clips here, and you can see that we have denoised this quite well. So what we're going to do, let's go ahead and export this out as a really high quality DNX HR 444 10-bit file. Now if you're on Mac, you can use Apple ProRes, so this is the equivalent on Windows. So we're not going to do any audio, we're just going to export this out. This is perceptually lossless, not technically, but you're not going to really lose any quality here. Now if you wanted to adjust some exposure stuff prior to exporting out, you probably should, because right now we have all of the information from the EXRs, but once we export this out, we're going to be losing a little bit of that, of course. But this is a filmic transform, and it's still providing a lot of dynamic range, all the real necessary dynamic range we need. I'm very happy with exporting this out as is. But again, just be aware that you could probably go ahead if you wanted to adjust exposure or anything critical, you can do it in here. But let's go to the delivery page and let's go ahead and save this to our folder here. We're just going to do resolve_export_neat video, no big deal. There's one more tip I need to mention. We're going to render as individual clips, and that will allow us to just quickly have all these clips rendered out, because I want to process them on a per clip basis in Video Enhance AI. So let's go ahead and add them to the render queue, and let's render all. We've got all of our clips rendered, and they have been rendered like this. Alright, so now we're in Video Enhance AI. Now this is a paid program, but it's usually on sale around the holidays, and in my opinion it's really worth it if you want to upscale your animations and make them sharper without actually having to render them at a higher resolution. It is, in my opinion, much better than just using a sharpening operation on your footage or your renders. So again, it's useful if you do a lot of animations, in my opinion. So we're going to grab our 5 clips that Resolve has rendered as individual clips and drag them into Video Enhance AI. And what I'm going to do is just find a clip that I feel has almost no motion, and this is one of the only ones where at the end there's almost no motion, because what I'm trying to do is Video Enhance AI is going to analyze all of the frames, and it's going to look for details, and it's going to selectively sharpen everything too. It's quite good. So we're just going to do a 2x upscale, so 2x upscale, and we're going to go to manual settings and go to estimate and switch this. Well, we need to make sure that this right here is, we're using 0.1 seconds, so we need to make sure that there's an ending there. So just go to estimate, and while it's estimating, I'm going to switch this to ProRes 422HQ. Now, I do not want to do any more noise reduction on this, so I'm going to get rid of the reduced noise. I'm going to get rid of the dehalo, and as for anti-aliasing deblurring, I'm going to bring this to about -12 or so. Now, I've been using this software for a while, so I know the settings decently well, but you definitely want to experiment a little bit and see which settings work for you. So I'm going to up recover details quite a bit and sharpen too. So let's go to preview. Now as you can see, I'm going to go and pause this. I'm going to full screen it, and you can see this is quite good. It might be a little bit too sharp, but it's actually quite good. We're basically upscaling this to 4K, and it's respecting the motion blur too, which is good. We're going to go back to the input. We're just going to go ahead and copy these settings and apply them to every other clip. Paste settings. So now if we go to this clip, for example, we can preview this and see how this looks. And as you can see, the details in these chairs, everything has been upscaled to 4K quite well. It's not perfect. We're going to be adding a little bit of film grain in the end to make this a little bit, to make it look a little bit better. So there you go. You can see everything's nice and sharp. Maybe a little over sharpened, but that's okay. It's fine. It's going to be okay. And now let's go ahead, and now that we're pretty happy with all this, you could of course look at every single sequence and make sure everything's looking good, but I've already done some tests on this, and I know that these settings are going to be fine to apply across the board to all of my shots. But again, you could of course analyze each shot however you want. So we're going to pause this, and you can see the upscaling is quite dramatic and impressive. This is where Video Enhance AI is quite good. It's also, it tries to anti-alias some of this too. It can even fix stuff like that, which I do not think conventional sharpening techniques can do that. That is quite sophisticated. The fact that it can do that, that is amazing. So let's go ahead and go back to input, and let's go and export. Let's select all of our clips and go to export. It says 5. So by default, Video Enhance AI is going to export all these clips back into the same folder as your source clips were. We're back in Resolve, so we're just going to use UHD 4K. We're going to be bringing in our exports from Video Enhance AI. So let's just grab them here and drag them in here, and then drag them here, so they'll be in order. So there we go. You can see they look quite good. I will then add a little bit of noise or film grain to this final result to add a little bit of imperfection at a global level to then mask out any local imperfections, and it gives it a bit of a filmic look. A little bit of imperfection can look quite good. So it depends on the circumstances and the goals of your project. But let's go and do that right now. Let's go ahead and add, I'm going to use Dehancer Pro. However, you do not have to use this software. This is paid software. You could use Film Convert, which is a lot cheaper, or you could just use your own the curves in your own software and your color adjustment tools. So whatever you want to use is fine. But I'm just going to use Dehancer. So I'm going to set Kodak Vision 350D. I do like this one. And I'm going to turn off the film grain. This software is very heavy on the GPU, so the film grain alone is probably the most sophisticated emulation of film grain I've ever seen. They actually use real film stocks, and they create the film grain in 3D. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this still here. Oh, I'm actually not going to grab that still. I am going to delete that, temporarily get rid of the node, grab this still, and then press Ctrl D to re-enable the node, and then we're going to have an image wipe here, because I want to change. I'm going to turn on my color head, and tweak my settings to where I can get a match that is roughly similar in overall color. We're going to also bring up the color density, and I'm going to create a node prior to this and up the saturation to something like maybe 60. And as you can see, we also can adjust the black point, but I'll use the vector scope or the waveform monitor for that. Let's just turn off, let's get rid of colorize, there we go. Let's go ahead and look at the original. There's the original. So we definitely need to adjust our black point a little bit, and we'll adjust the white point too. So we'll have that right at the clipping level. That's okay, it's not a big deal. So now we have Dehancer Pro applied, and it's changing some of our colors, but that's okay. I really do like Dehancer Pro. It's a lot of fun to use. So now we're going to add, now that we got our color mostly right, we'll add a little bit of tonal contrast. Sometimes I like to do about 3 for that. So we got a little bit of contrast going. And now we'll get to the fun stuff. We're going to go ahead and, we're not going to enable film grain yet. I'm just going to go to bloom and go to mask mode. And just the default settings are fine here. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. These are the default settings. So as you can see, it looks quite good. We've made it look a bit imperfect. So it's a little bit more, I guess, realistic of sorts. So anyways, let's bring down, we'll leave that alone. Now the vignette is pretty neat. So we'll just bring down the size to something like, oh, actually the feather. Bring the feather to something very low so we can actually see our vignette. Make it bigger and bring down the exposure too temporarily. Feather it out. Let's make the size bigger. Let's make the exposure a lot less. And let's turn it off and turn it on. Probably could feather it a bit more and bring down the exposure a little bit. And that helps draw the viewer in towards results. And finally, I think we're okay with that. So the last thing I like to do is I'll tone down the output here. So we're going to bring the total impact of the entire effect. This is the entire dehancer effect. We're going to bring it down to about 65%. And I find that that just tones it down a little bit. It's not going to be as obvious. So there we go. And again, if you don't like all that bloom going on, you can always tone it down. Now let's simply select all these clips and middle click over here, and now the effect has been applied to everything. So here's our final result, but we're not actually quite done yet. I went ahead of myself here. Let's add that film grain in. So again, you can add film grain in Resolve using Resolve's free tools, or you can, or any video editor. Every video editor has a film grain effect, or you can go all out and use Dehancer Pro's film grain, which is probably the most sophisticated film grain I've ever seen. It really requires quite a beefy graphics card to apply this film grain, but I don't want that much of it. I'm going to increase the film resolution. I'm going to bring it down to about 5, and then this is before and after. And it also tweaks the contrast a little bit, it seems. So we're just going to change our black point down just a little bit, our white point just a little bit up to compensate. And now we have film grain applied to make this a bit imperfect. Now if you're rendering this for YouTube, you probably could just turn off the film grain, because YouTube's going to denoise your video anyway and remove that film grain, and now you're actually going to have a slightly lower quality result. But if you're delivering this to like a high-end client, then adding the film grain and then rendering as a really high quality file, you definitely want to preserve the film grain is what I'm saying. But for this YouTube render, I'm probably going to turn off the film grain. But if I was rendering this for like a high-end production or something, I would go ahead and enable the film grain, because it does help mask some of those imperfections. Those imperfections in Video Enhance AI, you see that noise pattern that's so weird how it looks the same right around here? Well, by enabling the film grain, really any film grain, it doesn't have to be from Dehancer Pro, it could be film grain in Resolve or Premiere Pro, whatever software you use. Now we have broken up that film grain. So now things are looking quite good. Alright, so I'm going to render this out as a high quality DNX HR. Let's just go ahead and press I for an input or an in point. We're going to go over here. We're going to press O for an out point. And now with that, we can again render individual clips. But in this case, I'm just going to render one big single clip, because now we've got our animation done. So the render settings here are quite simple. We're just going to use the same thing as before. DNX HR 444 10-bit. 3840 by 2160, no audio. We're going to save this out. And we're just going to add this to the render queue and hit render all. Now, this is a very high quality export from Resolve. You could also just import, you could also just export a H.265 or H.264, but in this case I'm rendering out a very high quality DNX HR 444 10-bit file, so it's very high quality. However, I'm going to use a free tool called Handbrake, and with Handbrake I'm going to grab the final video when it's done rendering, which it should be done in a second. There it is. Let's drag it into Handbrake, and I'm going to render this out to an H.265. So we're just going to switch this on over to Production Max. That's the preset we'll be using. We're going to go to Video here and set the codec to H.265 10-bit. And the constant quality slider is what I'll be using. Now, if you are rendering a video without noise in it, you could use 18, and that produces a small file which is very high quality. But if you want to preserve that noise pattern, you probably want to be going with like 15 or maybe 12. I think that's a bit more of a placebo kind of, but 15 to 12 is, at least for me, that gives me results I like. But the higher this slider, the more to the right this slider is, the higher the quality and the smaller the RF number. And this is a logarithmic scale, so 15 to 10, 10 is not just a little bit better than 15, it is a lot better. So you have to watch out with this slider. If you slide it all the way, your file is going to be massive. So it's going to be lossless. It's going to end up being larger than these DNX HR files. You're not going to get any quality increase. So at that point, you're just wasting storage space. So you definitely don't want to bring it up here, anywhere near here. The default settings are 2 for production quality, but personally I think that's a bit too high. So I think 12 is fine, especially if it's for a YouTube upload. And again, YouTube will denoise it anyway, but maybe for a client 10 or 12, and then maybe for a noiseless video around 18 for YouTube. I'm going to go and set mine to 12, and I'm going to change the file name here, and then I will render it out. So I do hope this tutorial has been useful to you. I did use a number of paid programs, DaVinci Resolve Studio, as well as Neat Video and Video Enhance AI, but in my opinion, these are fantastic programs to complement Blender or video editing in general. While Blender is fantastic, and you could probably do quite a bit of this in Blender, especially some of the video stuff, like the vignetting and the film grain. I'm sure you can do that in Blender's video sequencer. The denoising, really, the temporal denoising is done best, in my opinion, by Neat Video. I don't know of any better software, paid or free, that can handle the temporal denoising like Neat Video. And then Video Enhance AI it's pretty awesome. You can upscale your footage from 1080p to 4K, so it can save you a lot of render time. And in my future projects, when I'm rendering animations in Blender, I will be rendering in, say, 2.5K, upscaling to 4K, or rendering in 1080p and upscaling from there. So Video Enhance AI is very useful. It can bring down your render time. So I just wanted to show my techniques for denoising the sequence, and hopefully you can do some of your own experimentation and see what works for you. So thanks for watching.